Staying in at number 39, drawing class. Things we're going to learn. Key elements. We're going to learn about layout, typography, illustration, and we're going to have some fun. Things you will need: a piece of A3 and A4 paper, a pencil, a thin nibbed pen, a thick nibbed marker, correction fluid, a small ruler, a large ruler, maybe a scale ruler or a transparent ruler, and a rubber. In this class, we're going to learn how to copy this drawing perfectly. To begin with, print out the drawing that accompanies this file at 100% at A4, and then stick it down onto your piece of A3 in place with two little tabs of sellotape or blue tack. Then set out a grid from the bottom right hand corner across at 1 inch all the way across, so we end up with 11 columns, and then do the same vertically so that we have one full square starting in the bottom right hand corner. Then we're going to give this grid a reference, so A to H down and then 1 to 11 across. Next, unstick your A4 page from your A3 and remove the sellotape or the blue tack and set to the side. And then we're going to set out an A4 page and our grid onto the A3. A4 is 29.7 centimeters across and 21 high, and then we're going to do our same 1 inch grid from the bottom right hand corner like we did on the other page. And then we're going to give that a reference, A to H down and then 1 to 11 across. Now we can start laying out our drawing, starting with our typography. Using our 1 inch grid system, we can position the top line of the typography, starting with the easiest element to relate to that grid being the 39 logo. Position that in the top corner on grid A11 and to A9, and you can see that there's a nice square there. And then moving from left to right, begin with the S of staying in, we can start roughly laying out where these elements are. Notice where each part of each letter is in each grid. So like the curve of the top of S is in the center part of A1 and then drops down to about 3/4 down into B1. And then the vertical of T being almost on the border on A2 and B2. Carrying on across from left to right, you can then construct the rest of the letters with more accuracy as you go across. So don't be afraid to make a few mistakes, because we can then sort of adjust as we go along before we start adding ink, and then we can also use a rubber if we need to. The curves and points of the logo are particularly tricky as they are quite close to each other. Next, we're going to look at the smaller letters of drawing class, which rest along the line of C and D between the 3 square and the end of the 8 square. Just like we did with the larger letters, begin by roughly marking out where each letter is in its corresponding box, paying particular attention to where the verticals are, where the tops are, and the distance between each of the letters. And as you go along, gradually make more and more confident marks as to where the outline of the letters are going to be. Now we can begin to lay out where our characters doing their drawing are going to be. Begin with a rough circle for each of their heads. Calvin in F6 and Hobbes mostly in E4. Then notice where Hobbes's feet are, which is between D and E 8 and 9, and then his tail mostly being in F10. Then, if we follow the soft curve from Hobbes's foot to the top of Calvin's head, we can then go towards building up Hobbes's face, beginning with his nose, his eyes, his ears and his whiskers. As I come over to Hobbs's hand, I notice actually that his nose and his chin are too close, so I use a rubber to adjust. I can then begin constructing Calvin's face, beginning with his nose at the junction of F, G, 5 and 6, moving around to the curve of his face and then his spiky hair. Moving round to Calvin's ear at the edge of F7, then his hand, moving down towards his elbow, and then moving to the right across and forming his body. And noticing how the lines of his t-shirt form the contours of his body. Constantly referring back to our printout and our grid, we can then continue to build up the layout of the two characters and their page and their pencils in the way that we did with the letters, building up rough shapes and lines in each grid square and making more and more confident marks as we go along. So let's continue building up our two characters roughly in pencil while listening to some cool music. So now that Calvin and Hobbes are pretty much sorted, we can then look at their pen pot and the page in which they're drawing. Notice how the angle of the page defines the 3D space in which they are laying, with the corners of the page in G1, H6 and G8. Also notice that the drawing that they are drawing is the one that you are drawing, which is pretty cool. Then, once we are happy with all of our pencil markings, with the thin-nibbed black pen, we can then begin to confidently trace over all of our lettering in single flowing strokes. Once we are happy with all of our pen markings, we can then rub out all of our pencil, including the grid, before moving on to the large black marker. Wipe off your rubbings and then, with a thick tip marker, begin adding the heavy drop shadow to your large letters and logo. And then continue on to fill in the letters of drawing class. Then, with a thin tip marker, sharpen off some of the bleed from the large marker around your letters. Where there may have been overbleed or you'd like to try and tidy up some of your lines, use the correction fluid. With the correction fluid drying on our letters and our logo, we can then begin the really exciting part of filling in our characters and the scene and bringing it all to life with a thick black marker. Paying particular attention to line thickness, variation and irregularity, especially on Hobbes's fur, whiskers and on Calvin's hair. Continue filling in with a black marker and notice how the thick and thin lines, particularly on the pencil, gives a sense of 3D and shadow. Then finally, with a thin tip marker, move around the drawing and tidy up everywhere where you think could look a little bit sharper. And there we are. We have completed our drawing class. Marvellous.